Hello, everyone, and welcome to VIDA News Live. I'm your host, Dom Garrett, and this is your show for today, Thursday, June 18th, 2020. My guest on the show a little bit later is Michelle Minton. Michelle is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and we will discuss her new study entitled Perverse Psychology, How Anti-Vaping Campaigns Backfired, where she actually looked into the effects of anti-vaping messaging campaigns and how governments and health groups got it wrong. We also want to make sure to get any of your specific questions. So as you're watching the show, if you have any questions for Michelle, please make sure to drop those in the comments. You can do that right on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and we will make sure to get to as many of those as we possibly can. But at the top of the broadcast, I would like to start off with some good news out of Hong Kong. Hong Kong's Legislative Council, or LegCo, made the decision on June 2nd to suspend discussions on a proposed ban on vaping products. And they actually said that these products would provide smokers with safer, smoke-free alternatives. And this is obviously a victory. That exact words, we couldn't have written it better themselves, and we want to applaud Hong Kong. The Bill's Committee on Smoking was formed back in March of 2019 to address a blanket ban that was proposed in October of the previous year. The committee held 9 meetings. 3 of them featured public comment to discuss the potential ban. And like I mentioned just a moment ago, on June 2nd, they ended the discussions over the ban on both e-cigarettes as well as other heated tobacco products, or HTPs, known as heat not burn devices, as well as other nicotine delivery systems. In her statement released this last Monday, Nancy Laucus, who is the executive coordinator of CAPRA, which is the Coalition of Asian Pacific Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates, said that the organization is pleased to see Hong Kong's decision and that the impending ban was abandoned in favor of, quote, pragmatic, science-based approach to tobacco harm reduction. Now, this ruling was lauded as a victory by tobacco harm reduction advocates all around the world, but most importantly, by those that are living in countries in the region which are much more restrictive. The smoking prevalence in Hong Kong is only about 10%. But if you go just across the South China Sea, you get to the Philippines, where the prevalence of smoking is much higher, closer to 25%. And President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has not only been a vocal critic of vaping devices, he was also on the record last year saying, and I quote, "Smokers should be exterminated from the face of the earth." That's very strong language from a very angry president. And that's very interesting because President Duterte was a former user of combustible tobacco himself, but you still see him using this stigmatized and shaming language. Perhaps somebody should forward him our tobacco harm reduction update from last week, where we talked about shame and stigma. We will have more stories specifically about the region, about the South Pacific, about Southeast Asia, and those countries in the coming weeks. So please make sure to follow VIDA News for all of those updates. Now, our next story is started with a tweet. Some of you may have seen this. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States, their tobacco division sent out a tweet yesterday saying that tomorrow at 12:59 p.m. Eastern Time is the deadline for responses for their request for information that they say can help them address the recent lung injury associated with the use of e-cigarettes and vaping products. Yes, lung injury with e-cigarettes and vaping products. Let's take some time really quick to just unpack this. And let's start from what they're actually talking about. If you've been following tobacco harm reduction at all within the last year, you've probably heard the term EVALI, E-V-A-L-I. And that stands for e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury. This was the disease that caused hospitalizations in all 50 of the states here in the US, as well as the death of over 60 individuals beginning in June of last year. Now, the FDA and the CDC, the Center for Disease Control here in the United States, were quick to warn everybody about all vaping products. They believed that this may have been the cause, and they very quickly said, don't do any of this. Don't use any alternative nicotine products, any of that. However, the New England Journal of Medicine in December of last year said that the culprit of that outbreak was not just vaping products, it wasn't e-cigarettes, but instead it was something called vitamin E acetate. Now, that is a thickening agent that is added to black market THC vape cartridges. While the CDC and the FDA did eventually admit that indeed vitamin E acetate was strongly linked, by that time, well, the news had already gone out. We've had months of news cycles talking about how vaping equals lung injury. The term EVALI itself features e-cigarette right at the beginning, though there have been zero proven cases that the use of regulated alternative nicotine vapor technology leads to any lung injury, and especially not any death. And while this some people might be listening to this and like, well, this is just something that happens in the US. That's just that. It doesn't actually impact the world. Public health policy around the globe doesn't work that way. Most countries do not have the resources or the budget to be able to form their own CDC or FDA. And so the language that is used by those agencies is quite often parroted by different government agencies, leading to different policy decisions. President Duarte, like I spoke about earlier, he cited this exact outbreak as the reason to potentially ban all of those products in the Philippines. When we went to Colombia to speak with tobacco harm reduction advocates across Ibero-America, they also kept coming back to this EVALI and what people were talking about. Even though there had been proof that it was not about those products, that's what we had. We spoke with Tomas O'Gorman from Mexico. And while we were in Colombia speaking to him in February, the president of Mexico cited and parroted old information, not updated, saying that that was the reason why that country should ban those products as well. And we know that the age-old adage is true, that the retraction never quite has as much power as the original story. And so that brings us to this FDA request for comment. The reason that they are doing that is because Congress asked that agency to identify and evaluate additional steps that the FDA could take to address the recent pulmonary illnesses, again, associated with e-cigarettes and vaping products. And while that call is very specifically asking for comment about products, about different studies that that the FDA may not have seen, that have not been filed and indexed quite yet, we believe that Congress and the FDA are missing a very strong point. And that point is that language matters. And we are not alone in that. Scott Gottlieb, who is a former FDA head, tweeted in January that the organization comes up with precise nomenclature to be able to distinguish between products, to avoid any confusion by consumers or by other countries, for instance. And by not using precise language, this actually causes more confusion. And there are studies that back him up as well. On this program back in March, we discussed a study that was commissioned by Public Health England that showed that these false fears, the false fears around e-cigarettes, believing that they may be as dangerous as combustible tobacco, has led almost half of those people that smoke in the UK to wrongly believe that they are as dangerous, and it stops people from making that switch. This is how misinformation spreads, and this is how misinformation can be deadly. And we believe that this is completely avoidable. So what we want to do is encourage you out there watching right now to make sure that your voice is heard. If you go to vida.news/FDA comment, you will see essentially what I'm talking about right now. You will also see a direct link to be able to go to the FDA's website to leave a comment. We actually also put a paragraph there for you in case you just want to be able to copy and paste. It is very important that the FDA understands that their language and the way that they frame this question and this problem matters. We do not want to see illicit products. We want to make sure that the right focus is put in the right place and that the policies and the language that the FDA sets out does not have unintended consequences that lead to avoidable deaths around the world. As Clive Bates said on our program last week, public health experts need to pay attention to users' voices. They cannot just toss them aside as anecdotal. And as he said, when 10,000 people speak, you should listen. So please go to VIDA.news/FDA comment and do that. The deadline is tomorrow at 11:59 Eastern. Right now, there's just over 100 comments, and I fully believe that we can make sure that our voices are heard. All right, that's what we have for right now. Before we welcome our guests, I also want to remind everybody that we at VIDA News want to stress the importance of independent journalism, and that means that there needs to be diverse funding sources. And to be able to do that, we have launched a Patreon, where you can go to patreon.com/VIDA.news, /VIDA News, and you can see all of the different benefits that we have, a lot of different tiers. There's that interview that I discussed with Tommaso Gorman is there, and we will have much more content there as well. Okay, now I am very excited to welcome our guest on the program. As I said, her name is Michelle Minton. She is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. She studies consumer policy, looks into regulatory issues on a myriad of different topics, including tobacco harm reduction. And just yesterday, she published a study called Perverse Psychology, How Anti-Vaping Campaigns Backfired. And right before we bring Michelle on to discuss this, we want to show you a clip of an example of one of those anti-vaping campaigns from the state of California.
I play baseball, basketball, and play football. Those are the three sports that I play big time. When I first started vaping, I just turned 15 years old, so I've been doing it for about a year now. All my teammates do it. It's just pretty normal for everybody to do it.
People that I know that do it, they're like good students, like straight A's. It's a normal thing to do. I was 13 the first time I vaped.
People at my high school, they would vape on the bus just because it's like so easy to hide. It's just like a little like black pen. I could just vape at home, like my parents don't know at all.
Wow, there's a lot there to unpack. Michelle, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, so your new study that was just published yesterday, Perverse Psychology. For those of our audience that have not had a chance to be able to review that, can you give us a quick overview?
Right. So I actually finished writing it in February. So it took, with COVID and everything, it took a while to come out, but it's an idea that's been percolating for a while. I usually start my research papers with a question. I look at something in the world and I say, that's weird. What happened? Or where did this come from? And so, we watched in the US with the National Youth Tobacco Surveys, the number of students in middle and high school who reported vaping at least once in the last month just completely, amazingly declined in 2016 and 2017 by about 30%. And then all of a sudden in the 2018 survey, it spiked higher than ever before, and it continued to increase in 2019. And so, I was looking around saying, why would this happen at the same time as states are either talking about or implementing stricter regulations? I know Juul was pulled back on flavors. They removed a lot of their flavors from the market. There were a lot of Juul imitators as well coming out, but flavors were dwindling, and advertising among vape companies was being pulled back as well. They were either deleting social media accounts or really moderating, making sure like these are people in their 60s, not just in their 30s. So it's very clear these are not children. So like, what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years that has increased youth experimentation with vaping? So I started looking through the evidence, and I had an idea of what might be going on because we've been talking about this for a while with the FDA and local health departments functionally advertising e-cigarettes directly at youth. And when I started looking into how the spending correlated with youth use and the way that child developmental psychology talks about some of the ideas of when you're talking to kids, how you can have what they call reactance or a boomerang effect. In common English, it's just rebellion. And so I was looking at this and saying, oh my God, these ads, like the ad you just showed, and there are even more shocking quotes from that one ad from California Public Health. It's almost designed to convince youth to give these products a try. And so that's what the paper talks about. And I think it's an important thing when you have these agencies going to Congress and saying, it's an epidemic, it's a problem, give us money to deal with it, when they're the ones who, honestly, I think they're the ones who are causing the problem.
Interesting that, you know, you use that word epidemic. And, you know, I know that in the paper and, you know, in other places, you've talked about how this is not really an epidemic because it's not a disease. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Right. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you really have to try hard to look at the data on youth vaping in the US and call it an epidemic. By the CDC's own definition, an epidemic measures a sudden increase in disease in a given population, more than what they would normally expect to see. So like flu, we wouldn't call flu an epidemic because we normally expect a certain spike. But if everyone started getting severe flu, kind of like what we're having with COVID, not flu, but a virus, then you might call it an epidemic. Vaping is not a disease, it's a behavior, right? We don't say there's I mean, some people certainly would say this, there's an epidemic of alcohol use. Alcohol use is a behavior. The disease might be cirrhosis of the liver or something like that, but there are really no known diseases yet caused by vaping nicotine vapor products. So it's on that front, it's wrong to say that, but on the other front, it's, yes, okay, maybe 28% of youth report vaping at least once in the last month. But when you actually dig into the numbers, which many other researchers have at this point, including New York University, they said most youth do not vape. The ones who vape habitually, it's a very small number, and among them is an infinitesimally small number, those who weren't previously smoking or reported never using any other tobacco products. So what you have is it's statistical wizardry in order to sell what it looks like, in order to sell a message. And FDA and CDC are not actually giving us a lot of times the information. And I know this has been talked about before, where Scott Gottlieb came out in 2018 and said, it's an epidemic, before the data was even publicly available for people to look at it. And honestly, I think the FDA, and I talk about this in the paper, the tobacco wing of FDA had been planning the epidemic talk, the epidemic line, long before, even when the data was showing significant drops in youth use. They had a lot of money for a campaign. They had an ad come out the same day, or I think 2 days after Gottlieb made his announcement, a commercial called "It's an Epidemic." I'm like, so they've been planning this for a long time, and we don't even have access to the data that they say that they're coming to this conclusion based on. So epidemic, no, but the word epidemic, you know, is when kids hear it, when kids are hearing it, and, you know, California Public Health Department's commercial gets into this, what an epidemic tells youth is that everybody's doing it, because we're talking about a behavior, not a disease. I think FDA was saying it's an epidemic, they'll think it's a horrible thing. But what teens are hearing is everyone's doing it. Then you have California Public Health Department have actual teens say, literally all of my friends are doing it, all of my cool friends are doing it. And it's like, that is the definition of normalization. That's what they are doing, not e-cigarette companies.
No, that is, I mean, just that exact example, you know, before this broadcast, you know, our production team was sitting and watching it, and it almost seems like a checklist of how you can get away with it, how easy it is to be able to do it. I want to say interesting, but it's not interesting. It's devastating that this is having that effect. And
I think the problem is that the video wasn't actually aimed at teenagers, because if it had been, and if they had any developmental psychologists on staff, they would have said, you are answering all of their questions. Why should I do this? Because there's fun flavors. They even talk about kids getting sponsorship and free stuff from companies. What won't I get caught? No, this is how you hide it from teachers. Well, is it dangerous, or all your friends are doing it? There's even a line near the end where a boy says, if you don't do it, you're looked at as an outsider. Like, and this is coming from kids, which is, you know, supposedly real kids. I know they were fed lines and everything, but that makes it even worse, because if it was the FDA saying it, CDC, or a teacher saying it, or even a parent saying it, youth would brush aside as authorities just trying to get them to do something they don't want to do. It coming from the media, which appear to be kind of independent, or from other kids, that they might actually believe. And watching other teenagers, actually showing teenagers vaping on camera, is just making the behavior so normal. And functionally, teens are saying, well, if everyone else is doing it, I may as well give it a try. And that's what you're seeing in the numbers, where I'm at a party. Normally, I'd be like, I don't know what that is. No, thank you. But I've heard so much about it. Maybe I'll take a hit off my friend's vape. And then when you get the survey in class, you go, yeah, I guess I did do it that one time at a party.
And then all of a sudden it becomes an epidemic. The interesting thing that I think you also bring up is that the questions around some of this reporting, when people say vaping, and obviously it's very easy to point to companies like Juul that have been in the headlines, but you actually raise a point that there's the possibility that it's not actually, nicotine vapor, but it could potentially be cannabis. Can you speak a little bit to how that is actually talked about inside of that data?
And this gets to your point about nomenclature, and I think it's a really important point, because the CDC and I understand that nicotine vapor products, vaping in general, is very new, and the CDC, the people who develop the surveys, are playing catch up with the rest of the world. But for the early surveys, they just asked about vaping. They started to get a little more specific. I think they added a specific question about Juul in 2018 or 2019, but they often don't ask, or I'm pretty sure in the National Youth Tobacco Survey, they don't ask, are you just using Flavours? Are you using e-cigarettes to vape cannabis or something else? So, we say youth are vaping, but then we have other studies coming out, and when you look at the number of youth who say that they have at least used THC once in the last month, the numbers are extremely high. And the National Youth Tobacco Survey by CDC used to ask about marijuana use, and for some reason in the 2019, so what we saw is 16, 17, 18, I think actually starting from 2015, the number of youth who reported using THC vaporized products was creeping up pretty significantly. I think by 2018 it was around 70% among college or among high school students, and then in 2019, nothing. We don't even know. Because they apparently didn't ask that question, or they didn't release that information. And that should be very important if you're talking about a vaping epidemic and people are using this information to go after the nicotine vapor market. If that's not what they're using, that's not effective. And that's one of the problems that I get to in my paper, is nobody in public health seem to be asking the right questions. And these are obvious questions of, for example, why are youth in the US reporting significantly higher numbers of past month nicotine vapor use or vaping than youth in England, for example, in the UK, where they have a very vibrant vapor market. They have, I think 18 is the limit, the age limit. They have nicotine limits, of course, but I think only 6% of minors reported use in the last month, or maybe ever use. 1.7% of minors in the UK reported use in the last week. Reported once or more times a week. That's extremely low. And then if you look at the 2019 survey in America, which was fantastic, because they finally asked teens, why are you vaping? And the number one reason by far was curiosity. It was, I think, twice as much as any of the other answers. In the UK, it's the same thing. They ask on the survey, why did you vape? In the UK, you'd say, because I was curious. Yet, in the US, we seem to have a lot more curious teens than they do in the UK, and no one in public health seems to be asking why. They just want to say, it's Juul, it's Flavours, it's advertising. We know. We're not even going to investigate the question. We're not even going to self-reflect and say, something we're doing maybe increasing youth curiosity. No. Even though DARE never worked, even though anti-littering ads increased littering, even though every other public health communication program has backfired, we're just going to keep on doing the same thing and just assume that it's someone else's problem. Because honestly, they have no incentive. If the problem gets worse, they can just say, give us more money.
And so I do want to speak a little bit, we mentioned that inside of the campaigns, there is discussion of flavors. That seems to be the hill that a lot of anti-vaping activists are standing on, is that these flavors are attracting youth, as you mentioned. The number one thing is curiosity. There was a recent study that was just published in the Journal for the American Medical Association saying that there is not an increased rate. And now we're seeing states like New York that passed, the flavor ban. Montana is working on passing one right now. Have any of this regulatory pressure around flavors, has it made a dent at all, or is it, pointing to the wrong issue?
I mean, if the numbers tell us anything, so we haven't gotten the most recent survey data, which might be a little skewed because of COVID. But if anything, it's hurting. The focus on flavors. No, the data has never shown that youth vape because of flavors. It's something I know Clive Bates has talked about this. I love his pizza example. It's kind of like saying pepperoni causes people to eat pizza because most people eat pizza with pepperonis on them. It's no, if you're going to vape, you may as well vape something that tastes better than just normal tobacco, right? If those are the options, and if we know anything about teenagers in particular, they like trying new things. They like trying a bunch of new things. And there's no evidence that flavors cause youth to start vaping. And one of the things I talk about in the paper is with cigarettes, for example. For a little while there, back in the 2000s, there were a proliferation of flavors in combustible tobacco. And right as they took those off the market because of regulatory pressure, that's when youth smoking started to go up again. Really disturbing, like extremely high numbers of youth starting to smoke again when they took them off the market. And I'm not saying that's why it happened. I'm just saying there's no correlation. The lack of flavors did not stop youth from using cigarettes. It's something else, right? I mean, none of us started smoking cigarettes or continue to smoke cigarettes really because of the flavor. Often that's not why you drink alcohol. It's you start to smoke, you hate it, usually, then you get a buzz, you start doing it more, and then you associate the flavor with the feeling and the experience of nicotine, and that's why you keep doing it. The flavor has very little to do with it.
Yes. So, I know that in your paper and, in different places I've seen, inside of the blogs, you do talk about, some potential other avenues that we could go down. Obviously nobody wants to have, kids, doing dangerous things that could be harmful to their health. So what do you think are some other options, some different ways that public health or governments could go to try to curb this increased rate of youth using these products?
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants non-smoking youth in droves to start using nicotine or any drug, or to start drinking alcohol when they're 13, right? Or drinking coffee when they're, prepubescent and still developing. But I think people in government, regulatory bodies, public health need to recognize that you will never be able to stop teenagers from experimenting with things. What you want to do is make sure that if they're going to do it, for example, underage sex, premarital sex, all of this, you want to make sure that they have the information so that they can make an informed decision, and that they can make a decision the safest, the least risky option if they are hell-bent on experimenting with some drug or behavior that has risks. And I think, honestly, we need to start communicating to the public. The FDA, CDC, and health departments need to start communicating to adults and stop focusing on the youth, because it is an advertising campaign to the youth. They are paying attention when you target them. And what it is saying is that this is an issue all about teens. This is a product for teens, about teens. And if you look at what happens in the UK, there's some communication aimed directly at youth, but mostly it's aimed at adult smokers. So they are associating vaping with smoking and quitting. And in the US, it's this very political, sexy, we've got lots of flashy ads by New York ad firms. We are not going about this in the right way. And it is not, I am not a developmental psychologist or a psychologist of any kind, but it doesn't take very much reading and very much learning to understand that psychology, developmental psychology, is very, very aware. There's a huge body of literature going back 50 years on what exactly not to do with communicating to teenagers and adults as well. Adults have the same proclivity. If you tell them you can't do something, they're very likely inclined to say, hang on, I think I can. With teenagers, however, because they have so little independence, any threat, any perceived threat to their independence, even just saying, you shouldn't do this, is enough to provoke a reaction in them saying, I think you're trying to put me in a box and tell me I can't do something. I'm going to prove to you that I can do it by doing it. I'm going to prove to you that I have autonomy by doing exactly what you told me not to say. I mean, it's the classic rebellion. I have a little cartoon. This is every parent who's ever raised a teenager knows this just instinctively. They know that if you tell a teenager not to do something, it's probably going to go out and do it immediately. What you need to do is give teens accurate, dispassionate information. Say, look, these things aren't probably, I mean, if you get them off the street, they might kill you immediately. Who knows what's in them? If you're talking about e-cigarettes, they're probably not going to kill you, but you might develop a dependence. That's very expensive. And, you know, especially if you're about to go to college and have less money than you've ever had in your life and lots of student debt. And all do you really want it? Do you really want that? And then, you know, we don't know exactly what happens in the long term, but if you're a smoker and you've tried other things and that doesn't work, this might be a route for you. That kind of dispassionate advice, honestly making it dorky. And Jimmy Kimmel, the late night TV host in America, he understood this perfectly, where he had a little bit, he said, the FDA is going to put signs in bathrooms telling kids not to vape. I was like, that's never going to work. But what you can do is make them uncool. And he brought out Vape Dad, who's just, you know, a dorky dad in khakis with a Bluetooth on, being like, yeah, I'm vaping pineapple mojito or whatever he was doing. You know, and I'm like, that's, Jimmy Kimmel gets it, right? You got to make it. And I think this is what was happening. I saw it happening in Canada in particular, and in the US, where there was this social conversation about vapors being douchey. You know, and that was building, and I was like, oh, I'm offended by this. They're just people trying to quit. They're trying to quit smoking. But I think that was actually more convincing to stopping kids from doing it than anything. And that stopped around 2016, 2017, and it started to become cool again because it became this hot button political issue instead of just a decision some, you know, jerky people decided to do and puff in your face. So honestly, I think public health has shot itself in the foot. But the tinfoil hat in me wants to say, I don't think they planned this, but it works out perfectly for them because they just get more money in order to deal with a problem they created.
Yes, and that money seems to be endless. We've seen that we've seen that time and time again. I would like to pivot a little bit to more of a broader topic of tobacco harm reduction. I know that you, much like myself, got up nice and early last Thursday and Friday to tune into the Global Forum on Nicotine. You also mentioned, having conversations. You and I were talking behind the scenes on that. I would love to get just your thoughts, your overall thoughts on what you may have pulled away from the Global Forum on Nicotine, and also just how you feel about, the state of tobacco harm reduction across the globe. You had an interesting tweet where you were wondering if the momentum started to be shifting towards people actually understanding harm reduction. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been wondering this for a couple of months now, since the tailing off of the THC lung injury issue. I've started to notice popping up in weird places, people who aren't necessarily already vapor advocates or people who are part of this space, starting to re-examine what they thought they knew. And it's small, and it's not happening very often, and it's not the people who have the most power, of course, but it does appear to be happening more and more. And in interest, I mean, we just saw with Hong Kong, how they rejected a vapor ban. That was fantastic. I know people in the Philippines are trying really hard to stop Duarte. You're seeing it in New Zealand, in parts of Canada, in parts of South America, although that's a really tenuous situation in South America, where you have what I call intellectual colonialism, with people like Bloomberg marching in with their billions and funding what appear to be grassroots groups and taking over the political conversation, taking it away from the people who are in the country with their money. And that's a problem. But, I mean, watching GFN, the Global Forum on Nicotine, was so heartening, I guess, because you have people talking about science and facts, whereas 99% of the conversation in the world is just talking points. It's people who don't know what they're talking about. Over the last 2 days, I've been watching a put on by, I think, the local health department in South Florida, a teen summit on vaping and marijuana use, and the two hosts that I was watching yesterday had no idea what they were talking about. The host at one point even said that Juul has highly concentrated THC. I'm like, okay, so you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and you're educating children. But, watching GFN, having an in-depth conversation about the actual facts, and you watch people on, I'll say, I don't like to break things out into sides, but on this side of the debate, you have people saying, this is what we don't know. Here's what we do know. And then on the other side, it is just the most insane, hyperbolic, self-assured. They know everything about vaping except for the long-term risks, but they know they're bad, and they know that banning it will be good. And I actually have a paper coming out soon trying to examine the different treatment between nicotine products and marijuana products, and how the evidence hurdle for nicotine vapor products is impossible. The amount of data that they want compared to other products, I mean, the amount of data that people on the anti-side are asking for is higher than what we demand in the US for pharmaceutical drugs. Pharmaceutical drugs have been put on the market with less data than we currently have now, long-term research about vaping products. Yet, there's something different about nicotine vapor that says, yep, it's still not good enough. We need more data. We need long-term studies. Like, we have them. We have more long-term studies for this than certain, anti-anxiety medications that are already on the market. So I'm positive. I'm optimistic that things are starting to change a little bit. I think what's happening is the evidence is becoming so clear, so unavoidable, that people are now risking their professional reputations by continuing to say what they have been saying for many years. Because I think they see just around the corner, it'll become so clear how wrong they were, and they don't want to be there when that happens. They want to be long dead and long gone and have their organizations in somebody else's hands when people say, oh, you started a whole new drug war based on absolute no evidence. You convinced us to do this thing. We put people in jail and ruin lives and let billions of people die based on bad science and bad evidence that you told us. They don't want to be there for that. And I think they see that it's not going to take that long to get there.
Yes. And, I will echo your thoughts on feeling heartened and feeling like there is a wave. And, I really want to, I want to thank you for joining us on the program today. I believe that you are, the work that you are doing is definitely an ally in this space, and speaking pragmatically, speaking from evidence and science backed. And I hope that when the new paper is published, we can have you on the program again to discuss that and many other topics in this space. So thank you so much for joining us, Michelle.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. All right, that is Michelle Minton. You can find her on Twitter. I promise she is a wonderful follow. That is all that we have for our program today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just a reminder, please do go to vida.news/FDA comment to read that and make sure your voice is heard. Make sure to check out Michelle's paper, Perverse Psychology, how anti-vaping campaigns have failed. And make sure to just check out our website, VIDA.news. You can sign up for our weekly email newsletter, check out all of our articles. We have some 101 breakdowns on harm reduction in general. And then you can also subscribe to make sure that you do not miss any of our future broadcasts. Thank you so much. Make sure to follow us on social, and I will see everybody next week.